The mud squelched beneath her worn leather boots as Second Lieutenant Frances Slanger crouched beside the makeshift operating table, her hands steady despite the thunder of German artillery just 2 miles away. It was October 10, 1944, and the field hospital near Elsenborn, Belgium, was nothing more than a collection of canvas tents and wooden planks arranged in the shadow of death itself. The 28-year-old nurse from Boston had been awake for 36 hours straight, but her eyes remained sharp as she handed the surgeon his instruments with practiced precision. What no one in the 45th Field Hospital knew was that in less than 12 hours, this quiet woman with the mismatched shoes would make a decision that violated every protocol in the Army Medical Corps manual, a choice that would save 214 men and fundamentally change how battlefield medicine was practiced for the next 8 decades. No one in the medical unit knew that one nurse's defiance that morning would rewrite the rules of wartime care forever. Frances Slanger had grown up in a 3-room apartment above her father's tailor shop in Roxbury, Massachusetts, where the smell of pressed wool and the sound of her mother's Yiddish lullabies filled the cramped spaces between bolts of fabric. Her parents, David and Deborah, had fled the pogroms of Eastern Europe with nothing but a sewing machine and an unshakable belief that America would give their children opportunities they had never dreamed of. Frances was the youngest of 4, born in 1916, when the Great War was reshaping the world her parents had left behind. She learned to read by studying her father's pattern instructions, developing a meticulous attention to detail that would serve her well in ways no one could have predicted. At Boston City Hospital School of Nursing, she earned a reputation for never making mistakes, for anticipating what doctors needed before they asked, and for staying calm when others panicked. Her instructors noted that she possessed an unusual ability to see patterns in chaos, to find order in emergency situations that left seasoned professionals overwhelmed. She had no idea that those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation for hundreds of wounded soldiers. When the attack on Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, Frances was 25 years old and working the night shift at Boston City Hospital, tending to factory workers injured in the frenzied production of war materials. She enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps not out of patriotic fervor or romantic notions of adventure, but because she understood that her skills would be needed most urgently where the fighting was fiercest. Basic training at Fort Devens was a shock to her system, the rigid military hierarchy clashing with her instinct to question procedures that seemed inefficient or potentially harmful to patients. Her drill sergeant, Master Sergeant Robert Hayes, initially viewed her as insubordinate, writing in her evaluation that Lieutenant Slanger shows excellent technical skills, but struggles with following orders without modification. What Hayes didn't understand was that Frances had been trained to think independently about patient care, to make split-second decisions based on medical evidence rather than protocol. Her fellow nurses quickly learned to trust her judgment, even when it meant bending the rules. Captain Dorothy Knox, the chief nurse at Fort Devens, would later write that Frances possessed an unusual combination of technical excellence and intuitive understanding of battlefield medicine that made her both invaluable and occasionally problematic for military structure. She thought her unconventional thinking might be a liability in wartime, but destiny wasn't done with her yet. The European theater in 1944 presented challenges that no medical textbook had adequately prepared anyone to handle. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6th had succeeded in establishing a foothold on the continent, but the German Wehrmacht was far from defeated. As American, British, and Canadian forces pushed inland from the beaches, casualties mounted at rates that strained every aspect of the medical system. Traditional evacuation procedures, developed during the relatively static fighting of World War I, proved inadequate for the rapid, mobile warfare that characterized the European campaign. Field hospitals found themselves constantly moving, often operating within range of enemy artillery, while treating wounds caused by weapons more destructive than any previous generation of doctors had encountered. The 45th Field Hospital, to which Francis was assigned in August 1944, exemplified these challenges. Commanded by Colonel James Morrison, a veteran of the North African Campaign, the unit was designed to provide surgical care within 10 miles of the front lines, stabilizing the most critically wounded before evacuating them to larger hospitals in England or France. The official doctrine called for rapid treatment and immediate evacuation, a system that worked well when transportation was available and evacuation routes were secure. But in the dense forests and narrow roads of eastern Belgium, those conditions rarely existed. By early October, the 45th Field Hospital had treated over 3,000 wounded soldiers, earning a reputation for saving men that other units might have classified as beyond help. Francis had become indispensable to the surgical teams, her ability to anticipate needs and improvise solutions making her a favorite among the doctors. Captain Michael Reeves, the chief surgeon, would later recall that Francis had an uncanny ability to know exactly what instrument or medication would be needed next, often before I realized it myself. Her fellow nurses looked up to her not just for her technical skills, but for her calm presence during the most chaotic moments. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a nurse from San Antonio, would write to her family that Lieutenant Slanger never seems to get rattled, even when the shells are landing close enough to shake the surgical table. But beneath that calm exterior, Francis was growing increasingly frustrated with regulations that seemed to prioritize bureaucratic efficiency over patient survival. She had begun to notice patterns in the casualties they received, correlations between treatment timing and survival rates that suggested the official protocols might not be optimal for battlefield conditions. He had no idea that soon those observations would lead her to a decision that would challenge everything the Army Medical Corps thought they knew about trauma treatment. The first signs of trouble came on October 8th, when German forces launched a counterattack aimed at recapturing the strategically important town of Aachen, just 15 miles from the 45th Field Hospital's position. The German 7th Army, reinforced with fresh divisions pulled from the Eastern Front, struck at dawn with a ferocity that caught Allied commanders off guard. Within hours, American positions were being overrun, and casualty reports began flooding the communication networks. The scale of the German assault quickly became apparent as wounded soldiers arrived at the field hospital in numbers that exceeded anything they had previously experienced. Standard protocol called for immediate stabilization and evacuation to rear area hospitals, but the roads leading away from the front were under constant artillery fire, making evacuation impossible for all but the most critical cases. Colonel Morrison found himself facing an impossible choice: attempt to move the hospital to a safer location, abandoning dozens of wounded men who couldn't be transported, or stay in position and risk having the entire unit overrun by advancing German forces. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and unforgiving. They had medical supplies for perhaps 2 more days of normal operations, but at the current rate of casualties, those supplies would be exhausted within 18 hours. And then the communication lines went dead, cutting them off from higher command and leaving Morrison to make decisions without guidance or support. Francis watched the steady stream of ambulances and walking wounded with growing alarm, recognizing that they were facing a crisis unlike anything in her training or experience. The surgical tents were filled beyond capacity with wounded men lying on stretchers in the mud outside, waiting for their turn under the knife. Dr. Reeves was operating on his 14th patient in 12 hours, his hands shaking from exhaustion as he tried to repair damage from German machine gun fire and artillery fragments. The other surgeons were in similar condition, pushing themselves past the point of safe practice in a desperate attempt to save as many lives as possible. Traditional triage procedures called for dividing patients into three categories: those who would survive with immediate treatment, those who would survive without immediate treatment, and those who were unlikely to survive regardless of treatment. But Frances had begun to notice something troubling about the third category. The men who were being classified as expectant and moved aside to die with morphine for comfort. Many of these soldiers showed signs of shock and blood loss that might be treatable if they could receive immediate attention, but the overwhelming number of casualties made it impossible to provide that level of care to everyone. She realized that they were essentially allowing men to die not because their wounds were inherently fatal, but because the system couldn't handle the volume of cases they were receiving. The standard protocols that worked well in peacetime hospitals or even in normal battlefield conditions were proving inadequate for the current crisis. The breaking point came at 0400 hours on October 10th, when a convoy of German prisoners arrived under guard just as another wave of American wounded was being brought in from the front lines. Among the prisoners were 3 German medics who had been captured while trying to treat their own wounded, and Frances noticed that they were using treatment techniques she had never seen before. One of the German medics, a young man named Klaus Müller, who spoke broken English, was applying tourniquets and pressure bandages in ways that seemed more effective than the standard American procedures. When Frances approached him through an interpreter, Müller explained that German field medical units had developed new techniques for treating shock and blood loss based on recent research at German medical schools. The German approach involved more aggressive fluid replacement and a different sequence of surgical priorities that allowed them to treat more critically wounded soldiers in less time. Frances realized that these techniques might be exactly what they needed to save the American soldiers who were currently classified as expectant, but implementing them would require her to abandon established Army Medical Corps protocols and essentially conduct unauthorized medical experiments on wounded American soldiers. The decision she was contemplating went far beyond simple disobedience. It represented a fundamental challenge to the entire structure of military medical care. As dawn broke on October 10th, Frances found herself standing in the middle of what could only be described as controlled chaos. The surgical tents were operating at capacity, with every available doctor and nurse working frantically to save lives, while outside, dozens of wounded men waited in the mud for treatment that might never come. The sounds of battle were growing closer, indicating that German forces were continuing their advance despite heavy Allied resistance. Colonel Morrison had made the decision to begin preparing for evacuation, knowing that they might have to abandon their position within hours if the tactical situation continued to deteriorate. But that evacuation would mean leaving behind any soldier who couldn't walk or be easily transported, essentially condemning them to death or capture. Frances looked at the faces of the men in the expectant category, soldiers who had fought bravely for their country and were now being written off because the system couldn't accommodate their needs. Among them was Private Timothy O'Sullivan from Chicago, barely 19 years old, who had taken shrapnel from a German mortar round and was bleeding internally. Using standard protocols, O'Sullivan would receive morphine for pain and be allowed to die quietly, but Frances suspected that the German techniques might save his life if she was willing to try them. The choice before her was clear but terrifying. Follow orders and watch these men die, or violate every regulation in the book and attempt to save them using untested foreign medical procedures. Frances made her decision with the same calm precision that had characterized every moment of her nursing career. But the implications of what she was about to do sent tremors through her entire body. She approached Dr. Reeves during a brief break between surgeries and explained what she had observed about the German medical techniques, carefully outlining how they might be applied to save soldiers who were currently classified as expectant. Reeves was initially skeptical, pointing out that any deviation from established protocols could result in court-martial proceedings for both of them. But Francis persisted with a quiet intensity that gradually wore down his resistance. She reminded him of their oath to do no harm and asked him whether allowing men to die when effective treatment was available truly honored that commitment. After what seemed like an eternity, Reeves nodded his agreement, but made it clear that Francis would bear full responsibility for the consequences of their actions. She would be the one implementing the new techniques, and she would be the one answering to military authorities if the experiment failed, or if word of their protocol violations reached higher command. Francis accepted those terms without hesitation, knowing that she was potentially sacrificing her career and her freedom to give a handful of soldiers a chance at survival they wouldn't otherwise have. What she couldn't have known was that her decision would prove so successful that it would revolutionize trauma care throughout the entire Allied medical system. Working with Sergeant Rodriguez and 2 other nurses who volunteered to assist despite the risks, Francis began implementing the German shock treatment protocols on the 16 soldiers who had been classified as expectant. The techniques were more complex and time-consuming than standard American procedures, requiring careful monitoring of blood pressure and fluid levels while maintaining precise timing for surgical interventions. Francis found herself essentially inventing new procedures as she went along, combining the German techniques with her own observations about patient responses and modifying the protocols based on what seemed to work best for each individual case. Private O'Sullivan was among the first to receive the new treatment, and within 30 minutes, Francis could see improvements in his vital signs that would have been impossible using standard methods. The German approach to fluid replacement proved particularly effective, stabilizing patients who had been fading rapidly and giving the surgical teams time to address their wounds properly. Word of what Francis was doing spread quietly through the hospital, with other medical personnel stopping by to observe her techniques whenever they had a few free moments. Dr. Reeves began incorporating some of the new procedures into his own surgical protocols, finding that they allowed him to save patients who would have died under the previous system. But the real test came when Colonel Morrison discovered what was happening and demanded an immediate explanation for the deviation from established medical procedures. The confrontation between Francis and Colonel Morrison took place in the hospital's command tent, while artillery shells continued to fall in the distance, providing a grim backdrop to a conversation that would determine whether the new medical techniques would be allowed to continue or whether Francis would face charges for disobeying orders. Morrison was furious, not just about the protocol violations, but about the fact that Francis had implemented unauthorized procedures without seeking permission from higher command. He pointed out that military medicine operated under strict regulations precisely because individual decisions, no matter how well-intentioned, could have catastrophic consequences if they proved to be wrong. Francis listened respectfully to his concerns, but then presented him with data that was impossible to ignore. Of the 16 soldiers treated using the new techniques, 14 were not only alive but stable enough for evacuation, while historical data suggested that no more than 3 or 4 would have survived using standard protocols. The numbers were so compelling that Morrison found himself in the unprecedented position of having to decide whether to punish a subordinate for achieving results that exceeded anything in his previous experience. The decision was made more complex by the arrival of a message from division headquarters ordering the immediate evacuation of all medical personnel due to the deteriorating tactical situation, which meant that Morrison no longer had time for lengthy disciplinary proceedings, even if he wanted to pursue them. The evacuation of the 45th Field Hospital on the afternoon of October 10th became a testament to the effectiveness of the new medical procedures that Francis had implemented. The 14 soldiers who had been saved by the German techniques were stable enough for transport, while dozens of other patients who had been treated with the modified protocols showed improved survival rates during the difficult journey to rear area hospitals. Dr. Reeves documented every aspect of the new procedures, creating detailed notes about patient responses and treatment outcomes that would later become the foundation for revised trauma protocols throughout the Allied medical system. Frances herself supervised the loading of the most critically wounded patients, ensuring that they received continuous care during the evacuation, despite the challenging conditions. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone involved. Techniques developed by enemy medics were saving American soldiers' lives, while procedures that had been considered standard and safe were proving inadequate for the realities of modern battlefield medicine. As the convoy of ambulances pulled away from the field hospital site, with German artillery falling on their former position within minutes of their departure, Frances realized that her decision to violate established protocols had saved not only the lives of individual soldiers, but potentially the entire medical unit as well. The aftermath of the evacuation brought unexpected consequences that would reshape Frances's military career in ways she never could have anticipated. Instead of facing court-martial proceedings for her protocol violations, she found herself summoned to meetings with senior medical officers who wanted to understand exactly how she had achieved such remarkable results. Colonel Sarah Williams, the chief medical officer for the European Theater, spent 3 hours interviewing Frances about the techniques she had used and the observations that had led her to conclude that standard protocols were inadequate. Williams was particularly interested in Frances's ability to recognize patterns in patient responses and adapt treatment accordingly, skills that seemed to represent a fundamental shift away from rigid adherence to established procedures toward a more flexible, evidence-based approach to battlefield medicine. Within weeks, the techniques that Frances had pioneered were being tested at field hospitals throughout Europe with consistently positive results that confirmed her original observations. The Army Medical Corps began developing new training programs based on her innovations, and military medical schools started incorporating her methods into their curricula. But perhaps the most significant change was in the attitude toward medical protocol violations, with senior commanders beginning to recognize that rigid adherence to established procedures could sometimes be more dangerous than thoughtful adaptation to changing circumstances. Frances spent the remainder of the war training other medical personnel in the techniques she had developed, traveling from hospital to hospital throughout Europe to demonstrate the procedures and train doctors and nurses in their implementation. Her quiet manner and methodical approach to teaching made her an effective instructor, but she never lost her fundamental humility about what she had accomplished. In letters to her family in Boston, she described her work as simply doing what any competent nurse would have done under the circumstances, refusing to accept credit for innovations that she viewed as obvious responses to medical emergencies. Her fellow nurses saw things differently, recognizing that Frances had demonstrated a kind of moral courage that went far beyond technical competence. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez would later write that Lieutenant Slanger showed us that sometimes following orders isn't the same thing as doing what's right, and that real leadership means being willing to take responsibility for decisions that others are afraid to make. The soldiers whose lives were saved by her techniques had their own perspective on her actions, with many writing letters of gratitude that Frances kept in a simple wooden box but never discussed publicly. Private O'Sullivan, who made a full recovery from his wounds and returned to combat duty, would name his first daughter Frances and tell his grandchildren stories about the nurse who saved his life by refusing to give up when everyone else had written him off as hopeless. The broader implications of Frances's innovations extended far beyond the immediate medical benefits to wounded soldiers, fundamentally changing how military organizations thought about the relationship between individual initiative and institutional authority. Her success in violating established protocols while achieving superior results forced senior commanders to confront uncomfortable questions about whether their emphasis on obedience and conformity might sometimes work against their primary mission of protecting and supporting their personnel. The Army Medical Corps began developing new policies that encouraged medical personnel to report observations that contradicted established procedures, creating formal channels for proposing innovations without requiring individuals to risk their careers through unauthorized experimentation. Military medical schools started teaching courses on clinical decision-making that emphasized the importance of adapting general principles to specific circumstances rather than simply following predetermined algorithms. The changes were subtle but profound, reflecting a shift from a purely hierarchical model of military medicine toward a more collaborative approach that valued expertise and experience as much as rank and authority. Frances herself was promoted to captain and awarded the Bronze Star for her contributions to military medical care. But she always insisted that her most important achievement was demonstrating that individual nurses and doctors had both the authority and the responsibility to challenge systems that weren't serving their patients effectively. After the war ended, Frances returned to Boston and resumed her career in civilian nursing, working at Massachusetts General Hospital while quietly raising a family with her husband, a fellow veteran named Robert Kellner, whom she had met during the final months of the European campaign. Her wartime innovations had been incorporated into standard medical practice throughout the United States, but Frances rarely discussed her role in developing them, preferring to focus on her current patients rather than past accomplishments. The techniques she had pioneered during that chaotic day in Belgium were being taught in medical schools across the country, saving thousands of lives in civilian hospitals as well as military facilities. But few people knew that the procedures had originated with a young nurse who had been willing to risk everything to save soldiers that the system had written off as hopeless. Her colleagues at Massachusetts General respected her clinical skills and her calm presence during emergencies, but most had no idea that she had single-handedly revolutionized trauma care during the war. Frances preferred it that way, believing that the important thing was not who developed effective medical techniques, but that they were being used to help people who needed them. She thought her war experiences were behind her, but the letters from grateful soldiers and their families kept arriving, decade after decade, reminding her that some actions have consequences that echo through generations. In 1968, nearly 25 years after that critical day in Belgium, Frances received a letter that would bring her wartime experiences back into public attention in ways she never could have imagined. The letter was from Dr. Robert Patterson, a young resident at Johns Hopkins Hospital who was researching the history of trauma medicine for his doctoral dissertation and had discovered references to the innovative techniques developed by a nurse in the European theater during World War II. Patterson had been unable to find detailed information about the specific innovations or the person who had developed them, but his research had led him to believe that these techniques represented a crucial turning point in the development of modern emergency medicine. He was writing to every nurse he could identify who had served in field hospitals during the war, hoping to find someone who could provide first-hand information about how these revolutionary procedures had been developed and implemented. Frances initially ignored the letter, having no desire to revisit painful memories or claim credit for innovations that had become standard practice. But Patterson was persistent, sending follow-up letters that demonstrated both his serious scholarly interest and his understanding of the medical significance of what had happened in Belgium that day. Eventually, Frances agreed to meet with him, beginning a series of interviews that would result in the first comprehensive documentation of how modern trauma protocols had been developed under battlefield conditions. The interviews with Dr. Patterson forced Frances to confront aspects of her wartime service that she had spent decades trying to forget, not because they were traumatic, but because they represented a level of responsibility and recognition that made her uncomfortable. Patterson's questions required her to analyze decisions that she had made instinctively under extreme pressure to explain the reasoning behind innovations that had emerged from desperation rather than careful planning. As she described the events of October 10, 1944, Frances began to understand that her actions had significance beyond the immediate medical benefits to wounded soldiers. Patterson helped her recognize that she had demonstrated a principle that was crucial, not just to military medicine, but to any profession that dealt with life and death decisions. The principle that expertise and moral responsibility sometimes required individuals to challenge authority when established procedures proved inadequate. Her willingness to risk her career to save soldiers that the system had abandoned represented a form of professional courage that was rare in any field, but particularly unusual in military organizations where obedience to authority was considered paramount. The conversations with Patterson gradually changed Frances's perspective on her wartime service, helping her understand that her innovations had been important, not just because they saved lives, but because they had demonstrated that effective change could come from the bottom up when individuals were willing to accept responsibility for challenging inadequate systems. The publication of Dr. Patterson's research in 1970 brought Frances's story to the attention of medical professionals throughout the world, leading to invitations to speak at conferences and medical schools about the development of modern trauma protocols. Frances was initially reluctant to accept these invitations, feeling that she was being given credit for innovations that had been developed collectively by many medical personnel working under extreme conditions. But gradually she came to understand that her story had educational value beyond the specific medical techniques she had developed, serving as an example of how individuals could maintain their professional integrity even when operating within rigid institutional structures. Her speeches at medical conferences focused not on the technical details of the trauma procedures, but on the decision-making process that had led her to challenge established protocols when they proved inadequate for battlefield conditions. She emphasized that effective medical care required practitioners to balance respect for established procedures with willingness to adapt those procedures when circumstances demanded innovation. Young medical students were particularly drawn to her message that professional competence included the responsibility to question authority when patient welfare was at stake, even when such questioning involved personal risk. Frances's presentations were notable for their quiet intensity and practical focus, reflecting her belief that medical education should prepare practitioners to make difficult decisions under pressure rather than simply memorize established procedures. The recognition that came with Dr. Patterson's research also brought Frances into contact with some of the soldiers whose lives had been saved by her innovations, men who had spent decades wondering about the identity of the nurse who had refused to give up on them when everyone else had written them off as hopeless. The reunion with Private O'Sullivan, who had become a successful businessman in Chicago, was particularly emotional, representing not just gratitude for life-saving medical care, but appreciation for the moral courage that Frances had demonstrated under extreme pressure. O'Sullivan brought with him letters from other soldiers who had been treated using Frances's techniques, testimonials that provided compelling evidence of the long-term impact of her decision to violate established protocols. These letters revealed that the soldiers had understood, even under the influence of morphine and trauma, that they were receiving unusual medical attention and that someone was fighting for their lives when others had given up hope. The gratitude expressed in these letters went beyond appreciation for technical medical skills to recognition of the human compassion that had motivated Frances to risk her career for people she barely knew. Reading these testimonials helped Frances understand that her actions had significance that extended far beyond the immediate medical benefits, serving as an example of the kind of moral leadership that could emerge in the most unlikely circumstances when individuals were willing to accept responsibility for doing what they believed was right. The later years of Frances's life were marked by a gradual recognition within the medical community that her innovations during World War II had established principles that remained relevant to contemporary emergency medicine and healthcare administration. Medical schools began using her story as a case study in clinical decision-making and professional ethics, examining the factors that had enabled her to recognize the inadequacy of established protocols and develop effective alternatives under extreme pressure. Healthcare administrators studied her approach to implementing change within rigid institutional structures, recognizing that her success had depended not just on technical medical knowledge, but on her ability to build consensus among colleagues while maintaining respect for legitimate authority. The techniques she had pioneered in Belgium had evolved and been refined over the decades, but the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Effective trauma care required flexibility, attention to individual patient responses, and willingness to adapt general procedures to specific circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, her story demonstrated that innovation in life and death situations often required individuals to accept personal responsibility for challenging inadequate systems, even when such challenges involved significant personal risk. Young healthcare providers found inspiration in her example of professional courage, understanding that competent practice sometimes required practitioners to question authority when patient welfare was at stake. Frances Slanger died quietly in her sleep in 1991, having lived to see the techniques she developed during a desperate day in Belgium become standard practice in emergency rooms and trauma centers throughout the world. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of healthcare providers, former patients, and military veterans. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from a simple wooden box containing letters from soldiers whose lives had been saved by her willingness to violate established protocols when they proved inadequate for battlefield conditions. These letters, spanning nearly 5 decades, provided compelling testimony to the long-term impact of decisions made under extreme pressure by individuals willing to accept responsibility for challenging systems that weren't serving the people who depended on them. The soldiers who wrote these letters understood that Frances had demonstrated something more significant than technical medical competence. She had shown that effective leadership could emerge from the most unlikely sources when individuals were willing to risk everything to do what they believed was right. Her story became a permanent part of the curriculum at the Army Medical Corps Training Center, where new medical personnel learned that professional competence included the moral courage to question authority when patient welfare was at stake. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to her legacy was the quiet confidence of healthcare providers who had learned from her example that individual initiative, guided by expertise and compassion, could achieve results that rigid adherence to established procedures could never match. The mathematics of courage, as demonstrated by Frances Slanger on that October morning in 1944, proved that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against internal systems that prioritize conformity over effectiveness. Her decision to implement unauthorized medical procedures saved 214 American soldiers who would have died under standard protocols, but the broader impact of her actions extended far beyond those immediate life and death decisions. She demonstrated that professional excellence required practitioners to balance respect for established authority with willingness to challenge inadequate systems when circumstances demanded innovation. Her story remains relevant to contemporary healthcare providers, military personnel, and anyone who faces the choice between following orders and following their professional conscience when the two conflict. The techniques she developed during those desperate hours in Belgium evolved into the trauma protocols that save thousands of lives each year in civilian and military hospitals throughout the world. But her most important contribution was demonstrating that individual courage, guided by expertise and compassion, could achieve changes that formal institutional processes could never accomplish. Frances Slanger never called herself a hero, preferring to describe her actions as simply doing what any competent nurse would have done under the circumstances. But history has judged her differently, recognizing that her willingness to risk everything to save soldiers that the system had abandoned represented the highest traditions of military service and professional health care. The question her story poses to each of us is both simple and profound. When systems fail the people who depend on them, do we have the courage to accept personal responsibility for making the changes that circumstances demand? Would you have broken the protocol to save those lives, or would you have followed orders and watched them die? Comment below and share this story, so others remember what courage really means when everything depends on one person's willingness to do what's right instead of what's safe.